My wife said we'd spend Christmas with her ex because our daughter needed her real dad. So I walked away. 1 week later, she regretted everything. The words hit me like a physical blow. Chloe needs her real father. In that moment, everything I thought I knew about my life, my family, just fell apart. We were sitting at the breakfast table in our Springfield home, just like any other Tuesday. Chloe was upstairs getting ready for school, completely oblivious to the bomb that had just dropped, casually, like the weather. This story, the one that ended with me watching my old life disappear 30,000 feet below, doesn't start with me leaving. It starts with a dollhouse. And a little girl who called me Daddy Daniel for 6 years straight. My name is Daniel. I'm 42, and for the last 15 years, I worked at a paper mill in Springfield, Illinois. I was the guy who fixed things, kept his head down, never made waves. I married Sarah when her daughter Chloe was 3. And that kid, she became my entire world in ways I didn't even know were possible. Every Saturday morning, we'd be out in the garage, tinkering. Her little hands holding the flashlight as I explained why you always measure twice and cut once. She listened like I was teaching her the secrets of the universe. The dollhouse took us 3 months to build. Proper wood, real shingles, tiny working shutters she painted purple, her favorite color. When we finished it, she threw her arms around my neck and said, "You're the best daddy ever." Nothing in my life had ever felt more right than that moment. Sarah was different, though. Always had been, I guess. Reserved, distant. She lived in the same house but seemed miles away. She worked in hospital scheduling, came home tired most nights. Scrolled her phone during dinner. Went to bed early. We existed together, but somewhere along the way, we stopped being married. I didn't push it. Chloe was happy, and that's what mattered, keeping things stable for her. Then came December. 3 weeks before Christmas, Sarah dropped it on me over breakfast. She told me she and Chloe would be spending Christmas with her ex-husband, Brian. That Chloe needed time with her biological father. My coffee cup paused halfway to my mouth. I asked if she was serious. Taking our daughter to spend Christmas with a man who walked out when Chloe was 2 and barely remembered her birthday most years? Sarah looked at me with this cold expression. She needs her real father, Daniel. If you don't like it, divorce me. The way she said real father. Like I was just some guy who happened to live there. Like 6 years of bedtime stories, scraped knees, and parent-teacher conferences meant absolutely nothing. I didn't argue. Didn't yell. Didn't slam doors. Something inside me just went quiet. That feeling when you realize you've been fighting for something that's already gone. I went to work that day and sat in my truck during lunch, staring at nothing. That's when I remembered an email I'd been ignoring for months. The company had been offering transfers to their facility in Auckland, New Zealand. Better pay, housing allowance, the whole package, for specialists who knew the old machinery. I'd turned it down 3 times. How do you move a family halfway across the world? But sitting there in that parking lot, Sarah's words on repeat, I realized I'd been putting my life on hold for people who didn't actually want me in theirs. I walked straight into my supervisor's office and told him I'd take the Auckland position if it was still available. He looked surprised, asked if I was sure, if my family was on board. I just nodded. What was I supposed to say? That evening, I came home. Sarah was packing Chloe's suitcase. Chloe was excited, her real daddy apparently promised a big Christmas. She asked if I was coming too. I had to tell her no, that I had work stuff. The disappointment on her face nearly killed me, but I kept my expression neutral. Sarah didn't ask about my day, didn't notice that something fundamental had shifted. She just reminded me they'd be gone for 10 days. The week before they left, I finished paperwork at work, sorted out my affairs, moving like I was underwater. The night before they left, I sat in Chloe's room after she fell asleep. I just watched her breathe, memorizing her face, the little purple dollhouse on her dresser that we'd built together. Christmas Eve, I was alone. I put on It's a Wonderful Life, what we always watched as a family. I sat in the dark, watching George Bailey realize his life mattered, thinking how ironic it was that mine apparently didn't. At midnight, I opened my laptop and sent the acceptance email. I told them I could start mid-January, asked for the fastest transfer possible. Christmas Day, Sarah called from Brian's place. She sounded happy in a way I hadn't heard in years. Told me they were having a great time, that Chloe was bonding with her real family. She didn't ask how I was spending Christmas. I didn't tell her about Auckland. Just said I was glad they were having fun, and hung up. When they came back on the 27th, Sarah seemed different, more confident, like she'd made up her mind about something. Chloe was quieter than usual, didn't run to hug me like she normally would. That night, after Chloe went to bed, I told Sarah about the transfer, that I was leaving in 2 weeks. I watched her face for any reaction. She just nodded and said, "Well, I guess that makes things easier." Then she went back to her phone. The next 2 weeks were surreal. Packing up my life, saying goodbye to coworkers who seemed more upset about me leaving than my own wife did. Chloe asked questions I couldn't really answer. Why was I going so far away? When would I be back? Could she visit? I told her I'd send letters and presents, that I'd video call whenever I could. But I could see in her eyes that she thought I was abandoning her, just like Brian had. My last night in Springfield, I drove past the paper mill, past Chloe's school, past all the places that had been my life for 15 years. I felt nothing. Just this strange, empty calm. The flight to New Zealand was 30 hours with layovers. Somewhere over the Pacific, I realized I hadn't cried once through any of this. Hadn't broken down, hadn't fallen apart. I'd just gone quiet and made a choice. Now I was living with it. Auckland was everything Springfield wasn't: quiet, organized, full of people who actually meant it when they said good morning. The company set me up in a decent apartment near the facility, clean white walls, furniture that didn't have anyone's history attached to it. For the first 2 weeks, I just worked and slept, trying not to think about what I'd left behind. The job was exactly what they promised: specialized maintenance on machinery most people didn't know how to fix anymore. My coworkers respected that, treated me like I actually knew what I was doing. I'd wake up at 5 o'clock, hit the gym, go to work, come home, make dinner, sit on my balcony watching the sun set over the Indian Ocean. And the whole time there was this voice in my head asking if I'd made the biggest mistake of my life. I tried reaching out to Chloe constantly. Sent her messages through the iPad I'd gotten her for her birthday. Told her about the kangaroos I'd seen, how different everything looked, how much I missed our Saturday projects. Complete radio silence. I told myself maybe Sarah was just keeping her busy, maybe she needed time to adjust. I sent a package after 3 weeks: New Zealand candy, a stuffed kiwi, a little wooden kangaroo I'd carved myself because I remembered how much she loved the duck I'd made her last spring. I paid extra for tracking. Watched it get delivered to the house in Springfield. And then nothing. No thank you text, no photo, nothing at all. That's when the guilt really started eating at me. What if Sarah was right? What if leaving made me exactly like Brian, just another father figure who walked away when things got hard? I started having dreams where Chloe was calling for me and I couldn't reach her, where I'd show up to the house and it was empty. My supervisor noticed I was off, asked if everything was okay. I told him it was just an adjustment. Then came the photo in early February, and that's when everything crashed down. My buddy Ethan from the mill sent me a message that just said, "Man, I'm sorry. Thought you should know." With a picture attached. It was from one of those photo booth things at the mall. Sarah and Chloe and Brian, all dressed in matching sweaters, looking like a perfect little family. Brian had his arm around Sarah. Sarah was smiling bigger than I'd seen in years. And Chloe was between them. But here's what got me: she wasn't smiling. Not really. She had this hollow look in her eyes that I recognized because I'd seen it in my own mirror. I stared at that photo for an hour, zooming in. I noticed the date. It was from last week, which meant this wasn't just Christmas. This was ongoing. They were playing house while I was on the other side of the world. I called Sarah that night, hands shaking. When she picked up, she sounded annoyed, like I was interrupting something. I asked about the photo, what was going on. She got defensive immediately. Told me I'd made my choice when I took the New Zealand job, that Chloe needed stability, and Brian was providing that. I asked to talk to Chloe. Sarah said she was already asleep, which was weird because it was only 7 o'clock there. When I pushed back, her voice went cold. You gave up the right to make demands when you abandoned us. And she hung up. I tried calling back. Nothing. Tried texting. Nothing. Tried reaching Chloe's iPad and realized I'd been blocked. That's when panic set in. Real panic. I'd left to preserve what was left of my dignity, but I'd never intended to lose Chloe completely. I called a lawyer the next morning. Some family law guy in Springfield that Ethan recommended. I laid out the whole situation. He was quiet for a long time, then said, Mr. Halverson, you need to understand something. Your wife filed for divorce 2 weeks after you left. In a tone that made my blood run cold. Turns out Sarah had filed in late January, citing abandonment and neglect. She documented that I'd moved to another country without discussing custody, painted a picture of me as someone who'd chosen career over family. The lawyer told me she was trying to establish Brian as Chloe's primary father figure, that she'd enrolled Chloe in counseling specifically to document the trauma of me leaving. She was building a case to cut me out completely. I asked what my options were. He said, honestly, from New Zealand with no custody agreement in place, not many. Family courts didn't look kindly on parents who left the country, even if the situation was complicated. He said the hearing was scheduled for late May, that I had about 3 months to build a defense, but I needed to be physically present in Illinois to have any real chance. I hung up and just sat there in my apartment, realizing this place that seemed like a fresh start was actually a trap I'd walked right into. Sarah had played this perfectly. She pushed me into leaving, documented everything, turned my attempt to preserve my dignity into evidence of abandonment. I checked my bank account that afternoon and found Sarah had tried to withdraw everything from our joint savings, $23,000 we'd been putting away for years. The only reason it hadn't gone through was because the bank flagged it as suspicious. I called them immediately, got it locked down, moved half into a separate account because the lawyer said that was the legal thing to do. Sarah called 2 hours later, screaming about how I was trying to leave her and Chloe with nothing. I just let her yell. There was no point defending myself anymore. When she finally stopped to breathe, I said very calmly, I'm coming back, Sarah. We're going to figure this out in court. I could hear the shock in her silence before she said, you can't just come back. You have a job there. I told her I'd already talked to my supervisor, that they'd agreed to let me work remotely temporarily, that I'd be back in Illinois within 2 weeks. And then I hung up. The guilt I'd been carrying shifted into something else during that flight back to the US, something colder and more focused. I wasn't going back to save my marriage, that was dead and buried. I was going back for Chloe. For that little girl who'd called me Daddy Daniel, built a dollhouse with me, and trusted me completely until I'd let her down. The plane touched down in Denver for my layover. I bought a coffee and sat watching families move past. Dads carrying kids on their shoulders, moms holding little hands. I thought about how I needed my daughter to know I hadn't abandoned her, that I was still her Daddy Daniel, even if her mother and Brian were trying to write me out of the story. Springfield in late February looked exactly how I felt, gray and cold and unwelcome. I landed on a Tuesday morning and went straight to a motel because I wasn't about to sleep in that house. My lawyer's office was downtown, in a building that smelled like old coffee and stress. When I walked in, he looked relieved, like he'd been half expecting me not to show. We spent 4 hours going through everything: bank statements, text messages, emails, phone records, building a timeline of exactly what had happened and when. He told me the custody hearing was set for May 23rd. Sarah's lawyer was pushing for full custody, with supervised visitation for me at best, arguing I was a flight risk since I'd already left the country once. I asked what our chances were. He leaned back and said, "Daniel, it depends on what we can prove. You've got financial records and work history showing you've been a committed parent, but she's got the abandonment narrative and the fact that you're not Chloe's biological father, which means you have no automatic legal rights here." That made my stomach drop. I'd been so focused on being her dad that I'd forgotten in the eyes of the law, I was just a stepfather. He said we needed to establish a pattern of parental involvement before I left, prove that Sarah had engineered my departure, and document her parental alienation over the past 2 months. We had 12 weeks to do it. That afternoon, I started making rounds. First, to the bank, where I got statements showing every deposit to Chloe's college fund, every payment for her school activities, every purchase for birthdays and holidays. Then to the school, where I talked to her teacher, Ms. Jenkins. She remembered me from parent-teacher conferences and volunteer days. She looked uncomfortable when I explained what was happening, but admitted that Chloe had been struggling since I left, that her grades had dropped, that she'd become withdrawn and stopped participating. I asked if she'd be willing to provide a statement. She hesitated, but finally agreed because, she said, "That little girl talked about you constantly, Mr. Halverson. You were her hero." Hearing that past tense nearly broke me. The school counselor was next, Dr. Hayes. When I explained the situation, she told me she'd received a subpoena from Sarah's lawyer and would be testifying, but couldn't discuss the specifics of Chloe's sessions with me directly due to confidentiality. What she could tell me was that she'd be providing her professional observations to the court. The way she said it, careful but meaningful, gave me hope that maybe the truth was more complicated than Sarah's version. I rented a small apartment on the north side. Nothing fancy, just a place to sleep while I built my case. Every night, I'd sit there, making lists of every soccer game I'd attended, every school project I'd helped with, every nightmare I'd comforted her through, trying to quantify 6 years of fatherhood into evidence a judge would accept. Ethan stopped by one evening with pizza and told me Sarah had been spreading stories around town, saying I'd abandoned my family for a job in New Zealand, that I'd never really loved Chloe, that Brian was stepping up to be the father she'd always needed. I asked if people believed her. He said, "Some do, some don't. Small towns, you know, but the people who actually know you aren't buying it." Over the next 10 weeks, I threw myself into building the strongest case possible. My lawyer got Brian's financial records through discovery and found out he was 4 months behind on child support from his first marriage, that he'd had 2 DUIs in the past 5 years, that his stability wasn't quite as solid as Sarah was claiming. We documented every blocked call, every refused video chat, every returned letter, building a pattern of parental alienation that even a skeptical judge would have to acknowledge. I drove past Chloe's school a few times, hoping to catch a glimpse of her, but never had the courage to actually approach, because I knew it would only complicate things legally. The weeks crawled by, March, into April, into May. The whole time, I was terrified that I'd come all this way and still lose her. 2 days before the hearing, I finally let myself drive by the house. Our house, technically, though it didn't feel like mine anymore. The driveway was empty, but I could see through the window that the living room had been rearranged. New furniture, different curtains, like they were erasing any trace of me ever being there. I sat in my truck. Across the street for 20 minutes, just staring. Then I saw her. Chloe, walking past the window, carrying something. Even from that distance, I could see she looked smaller somehow, like she'd folded in on herself. I wanted to jump out and run to her, but I knew that would destroy everything I'd been working toward. So, I just sat there watching until she disappeared from view. Then I drove away. That night, I couldn't sleep. Just lay in bed, thinking about how tomorrow would determine everything. Whether I'd get to be her father again, or whether Sarah and Brian would succeed in writing me out of her life completely. The The courthouse the next morning was exactly what you'd expect: marble floors, uncomfortable wooden benches, lawyers hustling between courtrooms. Sarah showed up with Brian, both dressed nicely, and she looked confident, almost smug, like this was already decided. She didn't even glance at me when they walked past, just kept her eyes forward like I wasn't worth acknowledging. My lawyer squeezed my shoulder and said, "Remember, stay calm. Answer honestly. Let the evidence speak." Then the bailiff called us to order, and the judge walked in, a stern woman in her 60s who'd apparently seen every custody fight imaginable. The next 4 hours were brutal. Sarah's lawyer painting me as an abandoner who'd prioritized career over family, who'd left without warning, who had no legal standing as a non-biological parent. My lawyer countered with financial records, testimony from Ms. Jenkins and neighbors, phone logs showing my blocked attempts at contact, with evidence of Sarah's parental alienation and Brian's questionable history. Then came the moment that changed everything. The judge said she wanted to speak with Chloe privately in her chambers. 45 minutes later, they came back out. Chloe's eyes were red from crying. But when she looked at me, I saw something I hadn't seen in months: recognition, and maybe hope. The judge sat down, reviewed her notes for what felt like forever. Then she spoke. I'll never forget what she said. "I've been doing this job for 23 years, and I've learned that biology doesn't make you a parent. Showing up does. And sometimes the people who fight hardest for children are the ones who chose to be their parents rather than the ones who simply are." She granted me primary physical custody, ordered a formal custody evaluation to be completed within 60 days to finalize arrangements, mandated family therapy for Chloe to process everything, and ordered Sarah to pay my legal fees due to her documented parental alienation. She also issued a temporary restraining order preventing Sarah from interfering with my contact with Chloe pending the final evaluation. The courtroom went silent for exactly 3 seconds before Sarah started yelling about appeals and how this wasn't over. But I wasn't listening. Chloe had pulled away from Sarah's grip and was walking toward me, slowly at first, then faster. And then she was running, and I was meeting her halfway, and she crashed into me, saying, "I knew you didn't leave me, Daddy Daniel." I knew it, over and over into my shirt. We went to my apartment that afternoon, not the house where we'd built the dollhouse, but somewhere new where we could start over. I made her favorite dinner while she sat at the counter, telling me about everything I'd missed: school, friends, how confused she'd been when I left. How Sarah had told her I'd chosen New Zealand over her, but she never quite believed it. That night, I tucked her into the guest room that was now her room. She held onto my hand and asked, "Can we build something this weekend like we used to?" I told her we could build anything she wanted. After she fell asleep, I sat in the living room, exhausted and relieved, still processing how close I'd come to losing her forever. How different this could have ended if I hadn't fought back. On the small bookshelf across the room, I spotted something that stopped me cold. That little wooden kangaroo I'd carved in Auckland and sent in the package months ago. She must have grabbed it from the house before we left. Seeing it there felt like proof that even when everything fell apart, some connections are stronger than distance or lies or time. Being a father isn't about biology or geography. It's about showing up, even when everything tells you to walk away. What do you think? Did I do the right thing fighting to prove I was her real father, no matter what?